So welcome to day 2 of DBXL's DBXL training. My name is Ernesto Machado, and right now we're about to head into module 3. The next logical step after creating your document type, setting it up to submit to DBXL, setting up your form to submit to DBXL, and setting up a database mapping to submit to the data to SQL, well, the next step is Sharepoint. How do we add a mapping to Sharepoint? And this scenario that we're covering in Module 3 is the integrated scenario. So there are a couple of requirements. They're not in the training module, but I want to mention them really quickly. The most important requirement here is that DBXL is installed on the Sharepoint server, and specifically on the Sharepoint 80 site. And the reason for that is, in the integrated scenario, DBXL and Sharepoint are intricately connected. And if DBXL is installed on a different site, then there are going to arise some issues between the communication between DBXL and Sharepoint. Can those issues be overcome? They definitely can, but that's not the focus of this training lab. So I want to just make sure that I mention that. And typically when we install DBXL on the Sharepoint 80 site, you're going to find that DBXL needs to use the same app pool identity as the Sharepoint app pool. So we go into more detail about this in the DBXL installation instructions. But just to summarize, DBXL is installed on the Sharepoint 80 site, and DBXL and Sharepoint, their app pools are using the same identity. So those are general ideas here. Keep in mind. So to add a Sharepoint mapping to our document type, we don't need to perform any change in the form. Recall that the form is submitting to DBXL only. And so what we're going to allow DBXL to do is to map that data into Sharepoint. I'm going to show you the training site that we have available here. Just so you see all site content, there's no form library, right? There's the documents library where I am placing the Word documents, the training modules themselves. But there's no form library. So what we're actually going to do is we're just going to let DBXL create that connection. We're going to let DBXL manage that connection. So I'm just going to put the URL to our site, and then I'm going to put the name of the form library that I want to be created. DBXL is actually going to go out there and create the form library. By checking this publish library in XSN, that's what I'm allowing DBXL to do. Publish the library, publish the form template, the XSN, out to that library. And so there's no manual step for us to publish from InfoPath. So that's all I'll do for now. I'll save that. What we expect to happen is this. The form library is going to be created, and that's it. That's all that's happening right now. The link between DBXL and Sharepoint is established, but there's no data transferred right now. It's just the creation, just the setup. So let me refresh the all site content page from our Sharepoint site, and you'll see that there's my form library. So I can go to my form library and I can click Add Document. That's going to open the InfoPath form. I'll fill out some data, just the required data, because I don't want to walk through filling out the entire form, but just to show you. Click Submit. This is going to submit to the DBXL web service, and if we go to the form library and refresh, we're going to see that document there. And you might ask yourself, well, if we go to the Documents tab, we have a bunch of these documents. We have 6 documents, 5 documents. Where are the other ones? Why are the other ones not in SharePoint? Well, it's because the documents were submitted before the SharePoint mapping was added. So SharePoint doesn't know about these documents yet. So what we can do is we can say, okay, so those first 4 documents, SharePoint doesn't know about them. Let me reshred them. So reshred is going to, yesterday we looked at how a reshred is going to sync the data to SQL, and I have a shredding error with one of the documents in SQL. But reshred is also going to reshred that data to SharePoint. So there they are. And one thing to keep in mind here is that once I submit this data, it goes into DBXL, and DBXL, without us knowing about it, DBXL is still mapping the data to the database. All right, so that's happening in the background. We don't need to worry about that. Now, I do have an issue here that's not in the training lab, so I'm going to stray a little bit. And one of the issue you might notice here is that I have similar names. So why is this happening? The reason this is happening is that my name is not unique. If I go back to the Documents tab, you're going to see that my name is not unique. I have 4 documents that have the same name. And SharePoint does not allow that. SharePoint requires that each document have its own unique name. So what does DBXL do to remedy that? DBXL adds the doc ID in parentheses. So it shreds the first one, and then when it encounters the next one with the same name, it just appends the doc ID. So what does that mean? That means that when you are in this scenario, when you're mapping forms to SharePoint, SharePoint requires that the name, the title of the form, be unique. So as a result, it is best practice to make sure that the name on your form is also unique. So we can just fix that very quickly. I'll just save down the latest form template, and I will open it in design mode. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a field. I'm going to call it DBXL name. And I'm going to define this using a formula. Because I know that employee name is not unique, and I know that start date is not unique, and I know that expense code is not unique. So it becomes a little messy to find a unique name. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to concat this to say employee name. Whoops. Dash. And then the formula now. The formula now is going to return a timestamp. And the reason I concatenate it with the name is that we can pretty much guarantee that the same user is not going to be submitting multiple forms every second. So if we use now, if we just use the formula now, it's just going to take the timestamp, and you might have different users submitting at the same time, so that's not going to work. But when we append it with the employee name, then we at least guarantee some sort of uniqueness. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually not going to put it in the default value. I'm going to put it in the onload rules. So I'm going to set the value of that field in the onload rules. Maybe not. That might make sense in a later lab, but it doesn't right now. I'll put it in the submit rules. because I haven't done the other lab first. So I'll change my submit button so that it lets me add that rule. So I'm just going to set the value of that field, and then I have to add back the submit. Okay. And the reason I want to put this in its own rule, the reason why is I don't want to be setting that name every time we submit. I want to set it only once. So let me put a condition on there. The condition is that the DBXL name is blank. So if the DBXL name is blank, I'm going to set the name and then I'm going to submit. So I'm just guaranteeing that I'm not recreating the name every time, because that would be a bad idea. So I'll reattach that to DBXL. And I'm probably gonna get a message here to save an update form. Just want to try that out. Well, that didn't work because I didn't enter my name. Oh, I made one more mistake. I didn't define this in the data connection. So that's why it's not showing. So I'll just change that to my DBXL name, and I'll save it and reattach it to DAT. And when I open the form, I'll get another upgrade warning from InfoPath. And I will submit this and refresh the form library. And there's my name is spelled concatenated with the timestamp. So that's my local timestamp, by the way, 14/28/24. So it's pretty accurate. I mean, we can sort of take a safe guess that no one user is going to submit two forms in the same second, right? So if we go back to the Documents tab, now we have a better name. It's a little bit more unique. Actually, the previous one was not unique at all, and this one is. Now, there's another checkbox here in the Sharepoint tab that I didn't talk about. It's called Use Form Services. That's what's going to allow us to open the form in the browser. So that's what we're going to do next. But before I go into the browser, I want to make sure that I check my form. So this is the design checker, and it says there are no errors or messages. So that means that my form is browser compatible. So let me go to the DBXL administration tool, check Use Form Services, save. So this checkbox is what tells DBXL that the form is going to be opened in the browser. Back in the form library, in the library settings, there is an advanced setting that allows you to switch between browser or client forms. Right now it's set to use the server default open in browser, but change it to open in browser just to force it to always open in the browser. So now if we go back to that form library, the form is going to open in the browser. and I'll add my name, and I'll submit. So there it is, submitted from the browser. So you can see that nothing changed. The database mapping didn't change. In DAT, all we did was check one checkbox, and then we checked the settings for the library, and that's it. Right? So as long as your form is properly designed to be browser compatible, then there's not much difference in one scenario from one scenario to the next. And we can reopen that, and we can add, let's say we add an expense code, let's say we add a department, and I'll add an item, or let's add an item, and submit that. And the reason I'm filling out this form a little bit more carefully is to go into SQL Server Management Studio, and connect to the SQL instance where this data is being mapped, so that I can show you that the data is flowing from the browser form through DBXL and into the database. So this is just going to give me the items. Let me expense reports. So those are my expense reports right here. So this is my browser form right here. My purpose is the same from the browser. So the data is flowing into the SQL table. And for that expense report 229, I had one item. So here it is. So, you know, it's just a quick verification that our data is still flowing correctly. Now, you will remember from yesterday's module that we added a condition to our database mapping. And the same principle can be used in your SharePoint mapping. You can add a condition so that certain forms are not mapped. So let's say that, let's look at our data. What could we use here to filter certain things out? Support. So see how we have two items where the department is support. So let's actually use that. So let's insert expression, and our expression is going to be an XPath. So we have to check the form. We have to just think about what the XPath is here. Here's the department node. So let me copy that XPath, and I'll paste that XPath in here. And hopefully I get this correct. I think I have the quotes incorrect. That's okay. I'm pretty sure it's double quotes. So now this mapping is only going to be applied to forms where this condition is matched. So this is what the form library looks right now. If I did this correctly, when I reshred all, 213. Let me just delete 213 because that was from an example yesterday where we were inducing an error. Okay, so now there are no shredding errors. So if I did that correctly, then my form library has fewer items. There they are. So those are the 2 items that we know match the support department. So what does this mean? I mean, we can get really fancy here if we wanted to. I'll just expand this one step beyond what's in the training lab, just to show you an alternative. All right, so let's say that you need the support, the support tickets, you know, from the department support in this library, and then you need the non-support stuff in this other location. That can be done. You know, just insert your expression here. So this is the opposite, not equal to. And we save that. That second form library doesn't exist. So DBXL is going to go out there and create it. Once it finishes creating, I switch to the Documents tab and I reshred all to make sure that DBXL pushes out that data correctly to the new form library. And then here I didn't change anything. I still have my 2 documents that belong to support being mapped to this location. If I go to all site content, I'll have a new form library for my non-support items, and there they are. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here, and 1, 2, 3, 4. I have a discrepancy because not all the items are getting mapped to SQL. We have a condition in the SQL mapping and we have a condition in the SharePoint mapping, so some of the items are not getting mapped here. That's okay. We've demonstrated the principle here is that you can have 2 different SharePoint form libraries that receive documents from DBXL. And let's say that we open this document and we make changes to the form. Let's say we add department, and now the department says support. So that form is going to disappear from my non-support library, and it's going to be pushed out to the support library. So DBXL is able to move those documents around, remove it from one SharePoint form library and add it to the other SharePoint form library based on the condition. Okay, so that is the SharePoint mapping as it is handled from the DBXL administration tool. Now, the thing with a form library is that you get all sorts of nifty controls, right? Your user can come here and say, you know, download a copy. They can hit add document. They can check it out. You know, your users have a lot of flexibility here with this this menu that shows up for each item, and also with the menu that shows up for the documents here. Lots of options for your user. So what if you just need to display some data and not really make it available to the user in a way that they can make changes and so on? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my form, go to my form options, and in my properties, my property promotion, I don't have any promoted properties, so I'm going to promote some things. Let's say that I want to show a web page that shows the employee name. I want to show the manager name. I want to show the expense code, the purpose. Let's say the department, and the total for the items. You know, just some sample data, just a minimum amount of data that maybe some restricted user needs to see. So let me save that, and I'll attach the form to to DBXL. Once it is saved, I'm going to reshred once again just to make sure that DBXL has pushed that updated data out to the SharePoint site. But here's where we deviate a little bit from what we've been doing so far. We're not going to be doing anything with a SharePoint mapping or a SharePoint form library. So let me just get out of here and let me launch SharePoint Designer. So I need to open this site. This is going to take a few seconds while it communicates with the SharePoint site and pulls down all the content. While it's doing that, let me just briefly introduce what we're doing. We're going to be using SharePoint Designer to create a data view page. It's a custom page that is going to give you greater control over what data you show or you don't show to your users. And I'm going to start off with the very basic example of just showing the data. So no option to modify, no option to download, no option to even open the form. Just seeing the data sort of the way that you would see like a report, right? So that's the first step. Once we complete that step, I'll show you some other things you can do with a data view. But let's focus on that first step. What I want to do here is I want to create a page. Here we go. I want to create a Webpart page. I'm going to create a very simple one because you can see how many options SharePoint Designer gives you. You can make these pages very fancy, but I'm just going to create a very simple one. And I will call it so there's my data view. Okay. And I need to provide a location. I haven't really created a structure for the site, as you might remember. It's a pretty blank site right now. You can see there's really nothing here. So the only option I have is to save it to site pages, so that's okay. Once the page is created, I want to establish a data connection between SharePoint and DBXL. So to do that, first I have to let this load, but to do that I am going to go to data sources, okay, here we go, data sources, and I'm going to create a SOAP service connection. And let me start off with the general tab. I will call this expense reports. And for the logging tab, I'm going to use Windows authentication. It's the way that the server is set up right now. It might vary in a different server, but this is how we have it set up. And the source, this is the tab where we really want to be careful. So the source is our training site with our Qdabra web service path. And then this is the same web service that we used yesterday to submit to DBXL, DBXL document service. And I'll click connect now. SharePoint's going to communicate with DBXL, and it's going to provide me that same list of options. So remember that there's a submit option that we used yesterday. there's submit document, right? So it's the same web service, but we're going to use a different operation, and the operation is called get list items. And once I select get list items, I get a list of parameters that I need to provide. List name, well, the list name is actually the doc type name. So we know what that is. We can provide that. And the view name is the same thing. Typically, get list items is used with a SharePoint list. So you can provide a list name and you can provide a view name. But in the case of using it with DBXL, you just provide the doc type name, and that's it. There are advanced options here where you can define a query, an XML query. You can define some fields that you want to query. Those are a little bit advanced for today's tutorial, as well as the query options, but I want to talk about the row limit. The row limit is limited to 100. So if you have more than 100 items, then you want to increase this. So in our case, we only have 6 or 7, so we don't have to worry about that right now. So I'll click OK. The SOAP web service has been created. It's stored right here. If I click on it, I can come back and modify, but I don't need to do that right now. What I do need to do is I need to return to my page that I had created, and I want to insert a data view. And if I find my SOAP services, here is my expense reports Ernesto data connection. I click on that. SharePoint's going to communicate with DBXL. It's going to detect, you can see here, item count is 8, and it's going to generate a view here, right? It might not be what we want, but it tries, right? It creates a page for us. And then we can start manipulating things here. So let's say we don't want a link, because as I said, this first example is just to let users see the data. So we don't want a link. Maybe the doc ID is pretty meaningless to users, version number, ref ID. So none of the data that we actually want is here. Luckily, we have this option here in the header called add remove columns. So we can just remove all of them. And then we can say, well, I want the department. I want the expense code. I want the manager name. I want the purpose. I want the I thought I had the employee name, but I'm not finding it here. I have the author though. The author is the same as the employee name, so that's okay. So then let me put these in some sort of logical order. Let's say that the expense code, department, and then the author, the manager, and the purpose. So that's a oh, and I had the total. Yeah. So let's see how that looks. So we're getting somewhere here, right? We have some things to clean up here, and we can clean up those headers manually. Expense code, department, author, maybe we want to call this employee or submitter. Manager name, maybe we want to just call this manager. Purpose, and then total. Total, you know, total isn't showing as an amount, so we can actually select, if we select that text right here, you see that there's a little arrow pointing to the right, and so there's this menu that comes up: data field total, format as, currency. So you can add the symbol, you can add the decimal places. There we go. So it looks a little better. So you know, you can manipulate this and make it look better. You can, let's say you want to shade this top row. Let's see where was that. yeah, there's right here. Right, so there that top row is shaded. I can make this bold. I can make this larger. So you know, etc. You can just keep playing around with this until it looks the way you want it to look. And there you go. You have a data view. And I'm going to save this. And Sharepoint Designer goes out and publishes the page to the site. And I can go to my site pages and I will find that page here. So if you had some sort of reporting, you know, that you need to let people know in a very general way, give them a glimpse into this process, then you know, you achieve it right here, right? There's an expense code, there's a department, and so on and so forth. There are a million options you can play with here. I've just shown you a couple. One of the other options you have here is sorting and grouping. So let's say that you want to group by employee. So let's group by employee, and there it starts grouping by employee. There's a ton of options here. You can sort as well. You can filter if you would like, and you can add paging. So you can display only 10 items per page and then have people page through the results. So there are a lot of options here. I will let you play around with that to see what pleases you, what pleases your specific requirement. But I think the next logical step is, well, what if I want people to be able to open the form from the data view? So let me just remove that grouping. So just let's add a link to open the form. We don't really have a unique column here, so maybe we need to add a unique column. Maybe we do need that doc ID. And maybe we move it all the way to the left. So there's the doc ID. And I'll make it look a little better. So there's my doc ID, and let's say that I'm going to add a link to my doc ID, right? And you can add a link to any column. I'm just choosing the doc ID because I know the doc ID is unique. So I'm going to highlight, see how this is highlighted, and I can right click on it and I can select hyperlink, insert hyperlink from the ribbon, and it's going to provide me this window. Okay, so now I have to add a link. So how do I add a link? First option is we just add the link to the form that is stored in DBXL. So that's pretty easy because we have a link right here. DBXL gives us a link. So that's pretty easy. We're done. This has a link now. And if I refresh the page here, there it is. This has a link, right? If I click the link, it's going to open the form. It's going to open the form that's stored in DBXL. So if you're not working with browser forms, this is a perfectly valid solution, right? It's opening the form in the InfoPath filler, and that allows users to open the form. If they need to make changes and submit, they can. Now, if we wanted the form to open in the browser, then we need to make this link a little smarter, and I need to let this finish loading before I can continue. So there's the form. Okay, there it is. So let's make that link a little smarter. So let's go back to that hyperlink and let's remove that link because that's not the link that we want. And we're going to add a better one. Now, how do we get this form to open in the browser? To understand how the form opens in the browser, my suggestion is that we return to the form library itself and take a look at how the form library does it. So I'm going to click Add Document, and I'm going to take this link from the navigation bar, and I'm going to just study it, right? That's all we're doing. We're just going to study this link. So there are a couple of things to understand about what SharePoint is doing here. There's a base URL, which is just the form server, the forms server page, the service that DBXL SharePoint is running. And then there's a question mark. The question mark means we have some parameters coming up. And then we have the parameters. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to split each of the parameters into its own line just to make it a little bit easier to read. So we can talk about each one of these. Okay. So the first parameter, XSN location, that's the path, the URL to the form template. So you can see it's pretty straightforward. It's our site, it's our SharePoint server, site, form library, forms/template.xsn. So that's pretty easy. That's our XSN location. Then we have a save location. Save location, we haven't enabled save in our form. We are forcing the user to submit. So in a way, save location is kind of useless in this scenario. Client installed just detects whether my computer has the client installed, the InfoPath filler. So we really don't need that either. Source is important. Source is the page where the user is going to be sent after submitting or closing the form. And default item open is a parameter that was inherited from SharePoint 2007, and as far as I know, the new parameter is called open in equals browser. So this is the URL for a new form. Okay. So if we go back to our page, in this table we're not adding a new form. We are modifying these forms, these existing forms. So let's just change the navigation here a little bit. Let's put a link that says create a new expense report. And I'm going to add a hyperlink to that. And I'm going to click on parameters, right? Because I need to start adding some parameters. This is exactly what we saw here. So our path, our base path, we know what that is. We just saw it. And we know our first parameter is XSN location. So we can add, and I keep losing that notepad in the background, but the idea is that you're defining each of these parameters right here. So there's my XSN location, and let's say the next one I define is open in browser. And the final one, source, let's say I want to direct the users back to the main page when they are finished. So let's try this. So let me save that. And we'll try it out. So here's a link to create a new expense report, and there's my form. And you can see that after I submitted it, directed me back to the main page of the site, which is the source parameter that was defined in Sharepoint Designer. Here's my new form that I just submitted. So that's as far as creating that's a URL for a new form. Great. Now, let's take another look at the form library, and let's open an existing document, and let's take a look at that URL. So the URL here again begins with this form server URL. Then it has an XML location. Then it has a client installed, source, and default item open. So pretty much the same procedure here. We're going to take the doc ID, or whichever column is going to be is going to contain the hyperlink. We select hyperlink, and it stopped responding. Okay, I'm sorry about this. Let's give it a few seconds here to respond. Okay, here we go. And then again, we go to the parameter screen. So in this parameter screen, again, we have to enter this base URL, this base path, and then we start adding our parameters. So we saw before that we used the parameter open in browser instead of default item open. We know that we got rid of client installed true, and for the source we used just the base URL for the site. So then the only thing that we have remaining as we parse this URL is the XML location. So we need to define this this parameter. And let's take a closer look at the value. The value of this parameter is / the site name / the form library name, and then there's this right here, which is the actual name, and then there's .xml. So there's no quick way of inputting this into the parameter screen here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna try to build it. And the way to build it is to think, well, this is hard-coded. The site name doesn't change. And this is, we know what this is. This is the form library name. That's fixed. And we know .xml is fixed because an InfoPath form that has been submitted is .xml. So that doesn't change. The part that changes is this, depending on the item you're trying to open. So what's that? That's the name. So let's find the name here. I think I passed right through it. Yeah, here it is, name. So we're going to take this name and we're going to incorporate it right here. So name is a variable, and that variable is going to depend on the item you're trying to open. And the rest of this is a fixed value. So let's try that. I'll save the page. Once it's saved, I'll open it in the browser. And let me try to open that last one that I had submitted. And there was an error. The form or template location is invalid. It doesn't like my path here, and I think I know why. It's because it changed my parameter name. One hint when working with Sharepoint Designer is to have a lot of patience, because as you can see, it goes into not responding quite easily. Yeah, so that's the problem here, that it changed my parameter name. So it should be XML location, because that's what we had. That's what we had before. So I think that should remedy the situation. I'll refresh that page and try that link again. And it still doesn't like it. Right, it's because we're using two different libraries for the mapping. So this is confusing the data view. So I'll remove these for now. I already illustrated what we wanted here. So whenever there's a condition and multiple mappings, we're going to have a smarter data view. I want to keep things simple here, so let me just remove that change, remove that condition and that mapping, that extra mapping, and reshred. So now still doesn't like it. So let's find out why. We're being told that this is not valid. So let's find out what it should be. It's this one right here. So it's looking for this XML location. Oh, because it's encoded. So it's encoding my XML location. So I wonder if I have another parameter here that I can use. Yeah, so the difference here is that the spaces are getting encoded. So that's interesting. I think I might be using the wrong parameter. Let me check. Let me add a new one. So there's a name. Okay, so I guess it's not liking these spaces that I have in my name. And I guess the way to fix this would be to come up with a name that doesn't have spaces so that it's better encoded. So let me see if I can think of something here. We were defining our name right here. And I have spaces here. And now, well, my name is going to include spaces. So let's instead use the expense code. And now it's going to include spaces. So let's just use the expense code. I don't want to get too far off track here. These are just little nuances and that need to get addressed as you develop your solution. So I'm not going to change anything here in Sharepoint Designer. What I am going to do is create a new expense report. I'm going to say that my expense code is that. And I will submit this. I will return to my data view. And there's my new document. If we take a look at that from the form library, it's right here. So the link to that is, yeah, so you see now the XML location doesn't have any encoding, doesn't have any spaces. So let's change that in the hyperlink here. And I'll let Sharepoint Designer respond. And there it goes. And I will change my... I don't think I need to change that at all. I think that's already... going to work. Yeah, there it goes. Because it's using the expense code as the name now. So let me see if I can reshred these and show them with the new name in the form library. Might be a problem because I didn't have an expense code in a lot of these. So that's okay. So it's just something to keep in mind. If you're going to end up doing a data view in the way that I have illustrated here today, then you just want to make sure that you're defining the name in a way that's not going to cause these encoding issues. What else can be done with a data view? Well, as I said, there is sorting, there's grouping, there's filtering. If you need to create different data view pages for different sets of users, you can do that. One of the benefits of using a data view web page is if you provide this link that we had initially used, the link that opens the DBXL document, that's going to respect DBXL permissions. So maybe we take a step back here and we talk about permissions, right? If you have a SharePoint form library, you're going to have permissions on that library. And most of the time, SharePoint form libraries inherit permissions, right? So you can stop inheriting permissions and you can manage the permissions here. So then you end up managing permissions on the SharePoint form library, and you also have to manage permissions on the DBXL installation. So it's two sets of permissions, and they're independent from each other. If you create a data view, like we have done, and you use this link, this DBXL link, that link is trying to open a form that is stored in DBXL, so it's going to respect permissions. And that means that you don't have to worry about SharePoint form library permissions, right? All you have to make sure is that your users can access this page. You could give access to every one of your users to this page, right? But if you have lockdown permissions on the DBXL installation, then they're not going to be able to modify this data, right? So that's one very clear advantage of data view web parts. To conclude this lab, I want to point out that the training module that we have just gone through assumes that you have a form library. So this is set up, the DBXL training is set up for the specific scenario where you have a form library and you're adding a data view, right? So the steps that you just saw are adding a data view on top of the SharePoint mapping. If you don't want a SharePoint mapping at all, you just want the data view, then we have some steps here on our website right here. Create a SharePoint 2010 data view that uses get list items to access DBXL forms. And if you're not on SharePoint 2010, we have a SharePoint 2007 version right below it. And if you want to learn more about the permissions that I have just talked about, we have a document right here, DBXL permissions when using SharePoint form libraries. And there's another document, DBXL permissions when using, right here, using document level permissions for browser-based forms in a data view. So there are lots of options, right? You can have a SharePoint mapping, you can have a SharePoint mapping plus a data view, you can have just a data view, you can have browser forms, you can have client forms. So the possibilities there are many, and it really depends on what you want to achieve in your scenario. If you need specific guidance, if you want more specific steps, you can contact us, and we'll be glad to point you along the right path.